Ms. Rachel Ong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start my speech conveying appreciation to the proposing team of this motion and to our many government agencies who have long started the good work to support Singapore in mitigating and adapting to climate change, especially our teams at NEA, NParks, MSS, and PUB. Also, many thanks to Minister Grace Fu for sharing Singapore's multiple efforts and achievements to date in mitigating climate change. One distinguishing mark in Singapore's policy-making approach is our ability to think generations when designing policies. At the price of popular vote, the government of today has often bitten the bullet, knowing that some benefits will only be reaped by our future generations. Today's topic on deepening Singapore's efforts against climate change is one such think generations policy. The trade-offs on current economic growth are real and tangible, especially in light of the heavy blow the pandemic has dealt to our economy. Yet to safeguard Singapore's long-term well-being in ways that even the deepest financial reserves cannot, we must act today. The start of 2021 saw several remarkable natural phenomena in Singapore, beginning with the non-stop rain that led to one of the highest recorded rainfalls in the past 39 years. We then saw mudslides and flooding in various parts of Singapore, and temperatures dipped to a low of 21.1 degrees Celsius. These unpredictable weather patterns have increased in frequency in the last decade in Singapore. Later in the month, we then saw pink-purple algae bloom in Sentosa waterways. The bloom is then believed to have caused the death of various fishes and marine life in the waterway, a consistent consequence of similar blooms in the Mediterranean Sea. All the above are not isolated, curious incidents, but are sure signs of the tangible negative impact climate has on Singapore, as pointed out by other members earlier. Singapore is now almost 1 degree hotter than our pre-industrial 1950s, and heating up twice as fast as the rest of the world. Without further intervention, Singapore may see our temperature increase from 1950s hit 1.5 degrees within the next 20 years. Today, Singapore remains in the top 30 nations in carbon emissions per capita out of 142, standing at 8.45 tons per capita. For this reason, and as party to the Paris Climate Agreement, we have set a target to peak at 65 million tons of carbon dioxide by 2030, a target I urge this House to review. Even at a previously projected population size of 6.9 million by 2030, which the government has clarified that we are unlikely to reach, we're looking at a production of 9.4 tons per capita of carbon dioxide, an increase rather than a decrease of where we are currently. I urge our government to take even more determined measures to lower our per capita carbon emissions, and to do so sooner instead of waiting to 2050 to halve this target. To maintain global temperature rise to under 1.5 degrees Celsius, every year and every decade counts. There are two mitigating strategies to a sustainable Singapore I would like to focus on. First, reducing our carbon dioxide emissions target. Second, increasing public appreciation and accessibility to nature and biodiversity. The first, reducing our carbon emissions. This can happen in two ways. The first, reducing production of new carbon emissions. And second, removing carbon emissions in the atmosphere. Singapore has made great efforts and progress to reduce production of new carbon emissions, an essential mitigating strategy to climate change. They range from the Green Mark scheme for sustainable building design, exploring renewable energy for transport and industry, extending research for new carbon capture and storage technologies, amongst many other initiatives. I also want to applaud Ministry of Transport's target to switch entirely to low emissions vehicles by 2040 or earlier. And we should not miss out on strategies to remove carbon emissions by using natural carbon sinks that already exist in Singapore, our forest. Forests, wetlands, and soils are some of the most effective natural carbon sinks. While Singapore has made concerted efforts to retain carbon sinks in our current marine and nature conservation areas, we should leverage to our advantage the remaining forests that make up 23% of our land. Our 1 Million Trees movement is an excellent initiative to increase our green cover and keep temperatures cool in Singapore. However, not all green cover is equal in their ability to sequester or absorb carbon. A 2015 study with Singapore shows that older trees sequester a significantly larger amount of carbon than younger trees we plant in new parks or sidewalks. Additionally, it is the production of biomass in foliage, woods, roots, and the soils that store the most carbon, all of which are found in abundance in forest and limited in other urban green spaces. Afforestation and reforestation are great measures, but retaining what forests we have, even secondary ones, and allowing them to grow to their full ecological potential will allow far more effective carbon sequestering rather than planting new ones. We can both plant new trees and retain the forested areas we have. We can complement our technological climate solutions with natural ones and support our remaining forests to do what they do best naturally to reduce Singapore's carbon emissions. The tension between conservation and development is real in our land-scarce nation, yet both are now equally essential for Singapore's growth. For this to happen, nature must be integrated as living infrastructure vital to our development as a sustainable city-state. Singapore should continue to explore other means such as upgrading older estates, redeveloping, or innovating current parcels of land for new use. Incentives can be given for current and new infrastructure to be redesigned or designed for multiple benefits and use, such as mixes of commercial uses with community farms, community centres, and schools. On our forest, the Clementi Forest covers 85 hectares and the Ulu Pandan Forest 33 hectares. It would be ecologically responsible of us to consider utilizing portions of the 1,500 hectares across 17 golf courses before reaching our forest land. I'm encouraged to hear from Minister Desmond Lee earlier today that by 2030, 400 hectares of golf course land will be taken back for redevelopment. While future generations can choose to rebuild golf courses, forests that are now removed will take decades to grow, and the connected biodiversity that we lose now may never return. Given the forest's accumulative benefits of stabilizing carbon emissions over time, we must consider our forests as our last resort. May I clarify that this does not mean that every plot of land that has existing vegetation and trees must never be used for development. But rather, I urge us to make deeper efforts as a nation to find ecologically better alternatives that also factor in and measure carbon sequestration of our land and other ecological measures as part of our decision making. Some may think that we are overstating the value of forests and biodiversity to our future generations. And this brings me to my second point. That is to increase public appreciation and accessibility to nature and biodiversity. Studies have shown that positive correlation of exposure to nature to environmentally conscious behavior. However, the amount of exposure Singaporeans have to biodiversity is limited as urban dwellers. We tend to have limited experience with nature around us beyond the roadside trees and carefully manicured parks. The impact on our population's environment comes as no surprise. A young volunteer at my constituency commented that his first memory of close encounters with Singapore's nature was the one during his NS days, and that it was not too pleasant. Much more can be done to instill appreciation and wonder for nature within Singapore in our schools and community. Some may be aware that Singapore hosts species that can only be found in our country. The Johnson freshwater crab, which thankfully is an unlikely candidate for chili crab. And the Tyrannosaurus rex is not the dinosaur, but a rare ant species named for its resemblance to the dinosaur. I propose 2 ways to raise public appreciation and accessibility to nature and biodiversity. First, through enhanced education. One benefit of the pandemic has been an increased awakening to our local nature reserves and parks. We should seize this opportunity to inform and interest our people on the biodiversity in our midst. At the same time, cultivating love for nature and biodiversity can start earlier through active education in our schools. This should go beyond the occasional excursions to nature reserves or classroom lessons, but rather regular immersive experiences in nature similar to the curricula we see in forest schools in Europe, US, and more recently, Singapore. An intentional and focused curriculum on nature is no longer a good to have, but a necessity as we raise our next generation to be better stewards of our environment as Singaporeans and global citizens. Such education should not be limited only to those who can afford private schools or enrichment programs. May our children's first immersion to our tropical nature not be in the form of military service, but through a growing curriculum of nature as their living classrooms. The second way to raise public appreciation and accessibility to nature and biodiversity is through per capita access to nature. Singapore has set a goal to raise our green space per capita to 8 square meters by 2030, just shy of the WHO's recommended minimum of 9 square meters per capita, and far from the ideal 50 square meters. It may be time to review this target and clarify green spaces as forests, nature parks, and reserves if we are to build an urban population that is not only healthy, but also increasingly environmentally conscious. In light of the climate risk we now face in Singapore, I support the proposing team's proposal of the 7th pillar of total defense, which I also prepared for this speech, but named it ecological defense. Singapore owns capital not limited to human and financial. Our natural capital, little as it may be, must be carefully invested in, even if the bulk of the benefits may only be reaped by generations to come. I appeal to this House to accelerate investment in our natural capital by creating a conducive environment for Singaporeans and for our companies to do so. In summary, for the purpose of mitigating Singapore's carbon emissions, I propose that Singapore further lower our 2030 targets for carbon emissions, not only by deployment of technology, but also by preserving the forests we have, especially rezoning Clementi and Ulu Pandan forests as natural reserves while exploring other land space for our housing and industrial needs. Second, I also propose raising environment consciousness in our populace through an early nature immersion for our children in education, and for us to increase the amount of green space per capita. This will support long-term sustainability efforts in Singapore. Building a sustainable Singapore is a responsibility shared by each of us. As individuals, we can all do more in Singapore's fight against climate change. The recent petition for Ulu Pandan forests has brought to national attention this needful conversation on Singapore's commitment to steward nature and fight climate change. Many residents and I are grateful for Mr. Sidney Chong, not because he started the petition, but because of his genuine care for our nature lived out day to day. My hope is that the conversation started will continue to extend to a larger national conversation on eco-friendly habits we intentionally adopt as individuals to make Singapore both a city in nature and a sustainable home for all generations. With this, Mr. Speaker, I support the motion.